everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Political Paradigm Shift podcast. I'm Heather Max, and I'm here to help moderate a special episode of our podcast, some debate between our resident centrist, Nick Chuck, and the ever popular Art Black, who will help us define how extremes on either end of the political spectrum can either help or hurt us nationally or globally. So our topic today is a comparative evaluation of centrism and extremism in political strategies. While our main focus will be on the extreme left versus the center left, we'll also touch a little bit on the center right versus the extreme right. And we'll begin with 7 to 10 minute introductions, and then we'll have 5 minutes for answers, approximately 7 questions, maybe 1 bonus question, and then some back and forth. And then 3 to 5 minute closing statements or arguments. As a part of your opener, I'm going to ask that the debaters give some definition to what the left versus right is, liberalism versus conservatism, if you want to touch on Democrats versus Republicans, and then what extreme leftism is and extreme right is. And then Nick, you get to go first, my friend.
Thank you very much. So welcome. Thank you, Heather, for that introduction, and welcome, Art. Extremism versus centrism. A comparative evaluation of centrism and extremism in political strategy. So centrism, as defined here, means the contemporary American center, which to me is sort of is a person or a politician who is more compromising, more tolerant of others' viewpoints. And then extremism, as defined here, means the modern fringe right and left wings of the American political spectrum. So an extremist can be a centrist, but I'll get more into that in a bit. So purely as a matter of strategy, extremists can have a significant impact to the party platform, candidates and leaders in the party, and the direction the party goes. Extremism on the modern right can be defined as white supremacists, MAGA supporters, and some of the more ardent libertarians. Extremists on the left can be considered Antifa or analogous groups, hardcore progressives, and radical social justice anti-racist ideologues. The thesis of my argument is that despite extreme right wings having the capacity to be extraordinarily impactful, they are often short-lived, detrimental to their particular political party, and dangerous to the country. However, it should be noted, movements in early America, like the American Revolution or the abolitionist movement, or civil rights and women's rights, were also once known as extremists. Therefore, the concept or existence of extremist ideas or movements is not inherently bad, but only necessary for specific things at specific times. For instance, violence is only warranted in a democratic system during periods of revolution. No other time should we accept or condone political violence. This is by definition terrorism and has no place in our system of government. Some of this presentation I've taken from research, and some of it I've created myself. I won't bore you with the specifics, but the initial point is my own, and the middle point, is a part of a research study done, and that I've applied to this sort of analysis. So I've developed 2 types of extremism that are relevant here. The first is ideas that are out of the mainstream. So this version of extremism would be something like 5 or 10 years ago, Medicare for all, or something along those lines, like it was out of the mainstream. This is less problematic because ideas outside of the mainstream should be considered and debated in any democratic society. For example, universal basic income is a perfectly legitimate policy proposal and should be debated. Dismissing an idea because it's unpopular or not presently being talked about is wrong. And the second type of extremism is an extreme approach to politics generally. So this one I consider problematic. To be clear, this definition can include all ideologies. So, like I said before, a centrist could be extreme if they adopted a violent or intolerant approach. It just happens less, in my personal opinion, with people who have more moderate views. This is a result of many things. So in a study published in 2019 called Psychological Features of Extreme Political Ideology, They examine the ways that the political left and right-wing extremes are similar to one another and different from moderates. So this is a quote from the study. They propose and review 4 interrelated propositions that explain adherence to extreme political ideologies from a psychological perspective. They argue that psychological distress stimulates adopting an extreme ideological outlook. Extreme ideologies are characterized by a relatively simplistic black and white perception of the social world. Because of such mental simplicity, political extremists are overconfident in their judgment, and political extremists are less tolerant of different groups and opinions than political moderates. Basically, they discuss how these psychological features of political extremists increase the likelihood of conflict among groups in society, end quote. So to be clear, when I say extreme in this debate, I mean people and groups that exhibit these subsequent, I'm going to say them, I just kind of went over them, psychological features. So the first is psychological distress, which is defined as a sense of meaninglessness that stems from anxious uncertainty. So psychological distress, this sort of is, I compare it to the terrorist breeding grounds for like radical Islamists. So poverty, war-stricken areas, where people are more susceptible to that type of recruitment. The second is cognitive simplicity. So they propose that extreme ideologies are characterized by relatively simplistic black and white perceptions of the world. This is the only example I could come up with in my head fast, so I'm not saying it for any other reason, but people who say things like the vast majority of MAGA supporters are white supremacists, I would consider a simplistic idea. And so, because, you know, I would say that it's much more complex than that. And so the next is overconfidence. This feature consists of a ridiculous level of overconfidence in their judgment. So all, you know, vast majority of MAGA supporters are white supremacists, and there's no other explanation, would be an extreme view from my perspective. And then there's intolerance. The final psychological feature is intolerance of different groups and opinions and moderates. Through the combined processes of cognitive simplicity and overconfidence, extremists may experience their moral judgments as moral absolutes, this is a quote too, that reflect a simple and universal truth. Such moral superiority implies that different values and beliefs in the groups of people who endorse them are considered morally inferior. So these are the stipulations, right? So to be clear, these characteristics apply to lots of people. So this is back to me out of the study. This is also true of mental illness. If you read the DSM-5, many of the symptoms of many severe illnesses can be applied to many people. But just like anything else, there are degrees. So therefore, individual and group extremism should be measured based on their degree of these 4 psychological factors. So intolerance, overconfidence, cognitive simplicity. All right, so now that we've identified what is happening, here is why it's bad. So I'm going to start with an example. So in 2011, there was this guy, Bob Inglis. I might have my dates wrong, and I think he's from South Carolina, but he was considered like the most conservative member of Congress. And basically, he took this sort of position on climate change. He thought it was a big deal. He wanted to raise awareness. As soon as the Republican establishment, Republican voters found out that this was his position, everybody turned on him. This guy was, you know, in the House for 6 years, and immediately his party turns on him, won't get elected again. So this is, to me, is a form of extreme politics. This guy is extremely conservative, has a voting record that's extremely conservative. And because he takes this one position, the party kind of kicks him out. And so extreme politics has been exacerbated, obviously, since Trump took office. Now, any lack of loyalty to Trump, in any way, is political suicide for most Republicans. This mentality forces Republicans and increasingly Democrats to support specific narratives and policy positions. I'm not making a false comparison. I think Republicans are worse, but that doesn't mean Democrats aren't also bad. Just making that clear. If those Democrats or Republicans choose to waver from their party line, they will be voted out. This is one of the factors creating a lack of action in Congress. I'm almost done. I got like another
2 minutes.
Oh, 2 minutes. All right. So I'm making good time. The base of the Republican and Democratic Party have become completely paralyzed from being able to compromise with each other. And as a result, it becomes almost impossible to pass legislation. This, therefore, makes the base of each party want to turn to more extreme levels, right? So they're sort of paralyzing their politicians, right? So they can't do anything. And if they do, then they'll, you know, from their base of support. And then because they're not getting anything done, they're getting angry, and then they're pushing their politicians to do more extreme things, like getting rid of the filibuster, like supporting, executive action as long as, it supports whatever their political interest is. And so the more the country goes to these extremes, the more authoritarian we become, both politically and socially to each other. And we must learn to compromise and be more amicable with our political opposition. If we can manage to moderate our approach, not necessarily our ideas, but our approach, we could lower the temperature in the country, restore our democratic institutions, and repair our broken political system. I'm done.
Nice, very good. And you went well under the 10-minute mark.
Okay, cool.
Well, Art, you're up. Same question to you, a few key terms, and then opening statements or arguments.
Perfect. Okay, well, I agree.
Based on all winners.
Right, all winners. All winners. Well done, everybody. Good job. Okay, so just when you think about it conceptually, moderation and extremism are both valid approaches depending on the circumstance. So if you think of them more as tools in your toolkit, then you understand that, like anything else, there are some times where certain approaches make more sense than others, and it really depends on the status quo that you are dealing with, and then where you might potentially need to go from there. So, and a lot of times this is depending on how stable and understood whatever given problem you're dealing with is. So, for an example, let's take a fire department. Since the beginning of time that man has had to deal with such things, fire has been an issue. And we've gotten quite good with understanding the parameters of fire, what the extent of the threat is, how to deal with it. And over a long period of time, we figured out ways to have infrastructure in place that can deal with a known threat that occurs under certain conditions that we can resource against. So with that, moderation is a very sensible approach. Consensus can build on a very large body of information and experience, and based off of that, a low risk, high chance of success approach makes more sense. And it's something where, like anything else, if you have a status quo worth defending, then moderation is the correct approach. So that's not the majority of humans' problems, but it's a lot of them. And a lot of problems that we face are things we face for a very long time. We have a lot of information on, and we've built up a certain amount of understanding where taking a weird, risky approach to something that we actually understand pretty well and know how to counter pretty well doesn't make a lot of sense. You wouldn't really want to engage in high risk, high reward behavior with something that you actually don't need to risk that much on. You can take countermeasures against it in ways that everyone basically agrees on. So that sort of thing, I think, is one good example of why you'd want to use moderation over some kind of an extreme approach. Now, it gets a lot more difficult as we advance because the status quo is always suffering from the encroachment of entropy. So things decay, things break down over time. And as an example, you just get hungry. You wait a long enough time, you need to deal with the fact that you just got hungry. So you need to move forward and negotiate with other partners in your ecosystem who might not also be hungry. So let's say you have a married couple and the wife wants pizza. The husband doesn't really want to go anywhere. He's happy at home and wants to watch WandaVision and doesn't really want to go out to the pizza joint. So in isolation, these are extremely divergent positions. One party doesn't want to go anywhere. The other person, has a certain need they want fulfilled. So your fundamental building block of that would be a negotiation where you figure out how to get both parties to get what they want. We like to call this win-win. So with this, you have an extreme position and a moderate position, let's say a status quo and a change position. And with that, you just order a pizza. You have a pizza person deliver the pizza. Wife gets to have her pizza. Husband gets to stay on the couch, keep watching his TV, and everyone's happy. So a lot of times there are a lot of problems where you could have a moderate position and an extreme position that can actually be solved through negotiation. So we have, pure, let's say a pure moderate position, and then a kind of a hybrid position that can be negotiated through. And then you might have elements that are extremely different. This is I think the issue that we tend to run across a lot in our society, where we have wildly divergent things. So let's say, for instance, that we have a husband and wife, and she wants to go on vacation and he doesn't. He doesn't want to spend any money. He doesn't want to leave the house. He doesn't even want to discuss it. He probably wants a divorce. So whereas the wife actually wants to, she likes the relationship, she's happy, but she wants to go on vacation. So for her, this puts her in a position of negotiation is difficult because there's no framework where he wants to go on vacation. He simply doesn't want it. Whereas she does want it. So one of these positions, and while his is the status quo moderate position, to her, it's kind of an extreme position. Like he basically has what he wants, but she doesn't have what she wants. So by virtue of the fact that he has, the status quo on his side, his moderate position to her is actually pretty extreme. Like the fact that they can't leave and go anywhere just because he wants to save money, like she doesn't like that at all. And from there, it's on her to engage in a negotiation to figure out where she could go. So let's say, for instance, she says she wants to go to Florida. Let's say she actually does want to go to Florida. He says, well, I don't want to do that, but maybe we could go bowling. She doesn't really want to go bowling, but like, if that's the best they can do to get out of the house, that's the compromise position, that where he isn't happy that they're going out spending money bowling, and she is unhappy that they didn't go to Florida. But they were both honest. They both said what they wanted. So let's say that she ups her ask, and she says, you know what, I want to go to Spain. So now the midpoint is not bowling. Now the midpoint is Florida. So with this is what we like to call the Overton window, where you have a framework where you can say what moderation and extremism is. And once you have set these boundaries as far as what you have on either side, from there, you have a context to discuss things in. So in any kind of human political or social relationship, having a context is important. So staking out a extreme position is actually very valuable as far as, moving forward in negotiation where you can have some kind of advancement between these positions. So with that, it actually makes more sense for her to, and maybe she'd be thrilled with it. I mean, maybe he relents and lets them go to Spain. Having positions that perhaps are a little bit further out than what you actually need, is an advantage. And it's one of the reasons why you do have extremists that will sometimes push further and they'll get a lot of support. But then when they get halfway to their goal, a lot of their support will drop off. A lot of people that support relatively extreme goals don't necessarily want those extreme goals, but they need to generate the kind of energy that a moderate ask doesn't get you. So just the way humans are wired, sometimes moderation turns into apathy, it turns into inaction, and it turns into failure. Whereas when you mobilize people towards a larger goal, even if you don't get there, you get the kind of progress that satisfies people, and it cuts into that unhappiness and that discontent. So having goals that might be a little bit larger than what the majority of your populace wants, a lot of times can help, at least in a mobilization effort, to get something to happen that otherwise wasn't going to happen, and winds up being a compromise that everyone can live with. They might go to Florida and turn out that, we had a great time. We spent some money, but it was okay. And a lot of times the status quo is more comfortable with itself than perhaps it should be, and it does need to be pushed a bit. And sometimes the extreme asks for more than it wants, and when it compromises and settles, it actually winds up pretty satisfied. So I think that a lot of times people tend to scaremonger the other side and look at the downsides, and certainly there are downsides. And we can take the analogy even further. Let's talk about space colonization. Let's say that you have a moderate position right now that we've got Earth and Earth is awesome, and maybe we can look at sending probes to other planets and all that, but nothing, no big deal. If we were to say, we need to pack up and leave, and we need to go to Alpha Centauri, that's an extreme position, and there's not really a reason for it. So you can have extremists. Yes, 2 minutes. Okay. So you can have extremist positions that are not well supported, that tend not to be very popular because there's no reason for it. They're not speaking to a necessity. Let's say an asteroid is discovered that's heading towards the Earth, and we have 2 years before it hits, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. So at that point, you still have that same option of high-risk behavior where we have to pack up as many people as we can go and leave under circumstances that are not safe and not well researched, but necessity can force your hand. So with with different circumstances, you can have different types of risks and rewards that calculate differently. And a lot of times these can be different person to person. If you're one of the people on Earth that isn't going to be saved anyway, then this might not be a great deal for you. You know, to have all services cut while the entire planet retools to build, you know, a couple of spaceships to get a couple thousand or million people off into the stars. You know, if you stand to lose something, you might not care. So a lot of times the status quo that people are born into is better than what they think they can get through negotiation. So by definition, they don't care if they're helping other people because it doesn't help them. So a lot of this, you know, we talk about it as though left and right is this universal thing, but really you're trying to solve problems for groups of people where other groups of people may feel they stand to lose, and they may feel that they need to take other equally extreme actions against it. And they might say, you know what, screw those starships. Like, we got 2 years to live, we should party. Like, you could have a very strong movement in other directions and say, that's not going to work. It's a waste of time. You've got these crazy schemes. And you could have extremely hardcore opposition to certain movements in the other direction. So a lot of that is, I'm sorry.
10 seconds.
Okay. And we'll get into some other examples of that later. But, you know, as a general rule, it's useful to think of these things in terms of tools in the toolkit that have their place and time. But in general, progress is better than entropy.
Okay, nice. Well done, guys. All right, so we're going to start off with the first question going to Nick. I remember you referencing in previous podcasts about the good that centrist policies have done for the world at large. I would like to know if you can expound upon that sentiment, and what policies do you view as centrist in nature that have helped shape the global response to, say, things like world hunger or the international vaccination programs? That's to you, Nick.
I mean, that is a pretty intense question without knowing about it.
Well, you started it. You did say this.
What was I talking about specifically? Just give me an idea. Oh, I remember what you're talking about.
There you go.
So I'm not sure I was talking about centrist policies. I think what I was talking about was policies that the right and left came together on to compromise and accomplish goals. And so they negotiated those things out, and then yada, yada, yada. The Civil Rights Act, right, is one thing. Social Security during World War, or right after World War II, with FDR. There is the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 90s. Jesus, I need like a Wikipedia right now. Those are the three that come to my mind.
Anything on foreign policy you can think of?
So it's stuff on foreign policy that the United States has agreed upon, like domestically, to do in terms of like.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, so here's the thing. Any policy that we have, whether it's foreign or domestic, on some level, if it was passed legislation, was the part of a compromise, right? At some point in time. So you could make the argument to some extent, right? Unless, of course, there was all Democrats or all Republicans in the Congress and the president. But barring those more unique periods of time, all legislation is a compromise, right? So anything, the United Nations, every alliance we have, like all of that stuff is on some level a part of some compromise that we've made in the past. That's sort of my point, though, right? My point is that you're not going to get to this other side unless you're willing to compromise. Now, I get, and this is just kind of me going off the question a little bit, I get what Art's point is about. He's sort of saying that it's sort of this bargaining chip, right? If I take a more extreme position, then all of a sudden I'm changing, the Overton window. I think that's probably true. And in some situations that probably works. And I'm assuming that we could probably find situations where it did work. I think what's happened today, and my problem with it today, is it's gone too far. And so now what's happening is the left is saying, we want all of this, and the right is saying, well, no, we don't want any immigrants at all. And the left is saying, give us all the immigrants, and then nobody's coming to the table. So in an ideal world where people are semi-reasonable, and every single policy proposal isn't like so out of the mainstream or so uncompromising that you have to be able to move over a little bit. Each side is just saying no and sticking their heels in the ground. So although I agree that that's a real thing and definitely a way to sort of negotiate, I don't really think that in today's climate it's a realistic way to think that you're going to be able to bargain with people. So.
All right. Sounds like you're ready for a rebuttal. Do you have anything to add to that, Art?
Can you restate the question for me?
Well, I kind of reframed it a little bit for you since you're supposed to be talking about how awesome extremism is. Is there anything in your mind that you can think of that was sort of like left extremist positions globally that have helped uplift humankind around the world? And what specific policy proposals do you feel might be passed by extreme proposals, okay, that would be better received than centrist policies? In other words, what you were talking about.
Yeah. All right. So for argument's sake, let's say 1776, the Civil War, World War II, things like that, or Cold War. So we have, and if you want to get to the real extreme of the deep extreme, then sometimes violence is the answer. And I got the question wrong on purpose. So you do have to, look at, human progress as a kind of an arc where things go up and down. And a lot of the good things that have happened due to them simply being forced in by, superior, strength of arms. Now, bad things have also happened from that too. So that's not to say that violence is always good, because a lot of times violence makes things a lot worse. But this is really a function of circumstance and capitalizing on good ideas and resisting bad ideas. And ultimately, violence can't make a bad idea work. And this is the problem where you kind of have a good split between, let's say, our more traditional, uses of violence in the United States that tend to reinforce the status quo in terms of like genocide, slavery, that sort of thing, versus violence that tends to push for more rights or for the government to follow through on promises it was supposed to follow through on. Anything from marches on the Capitol or protest marches for civil rights or things like that. There's certain elements where a lot of human progress is just because, fortunately, the right people, the right ideas pushed hard enough and created either military victories or political victories where the other side was just defeated. They just lost. And sometimes you can compromise. And a lot of times, if you can compromise with people, that's fantastic. There are some people who simply can't be compromised with, and they have bad ideas. And while that is not an ideal way to think, because in the majority of times, you do want to find compromise with people, talk things through, have the better ideas win. There are instances in our history, and most of our turning points in history were exactly that. Instances where the people with the bad ideas or the regressive ideas or the ones who were in the way of progress just had to be pushed aside. And their voices were not heard. They were not given consideration, be they redcoats, be they Confederates, be they Nazis, be they whatever. Sometimes the people that are in the way of progress just have to be pushed aside. So sometimes that comes to violence. Sometimes that comes to intractable political positions where people hold the line and they say, you know what? We think that trans people should have rights. We think that they should be treated equally. They choose whatever bathrooms they want. And the compromise position is actually inhumane. So we don't want to compromise. And if that means that you don't like us and we don't like you, that's okay. And this is, I think, where we get into issues where situations breed different necessities. And there are some situations where the compromise position is actually immoral. And sometimes, even if that means we don't get along for a while until, we win our wrestling match and, you lose and we win, be that social, be that wherever, sometimes that's just the right answer. And that leads to periods like we're in now, where we're simply stuck in a long-term power struggle with people that do not want to extend human dignity to others. And you either decide that's worth fighting for or you don't. And you think that that's something that you can barter away. And if that's position, that's position. But I think that in the general arc of human progress, there are some things that are worth kind of holding the line for, even if that means you have a temporary periods of inability to really meaningfully negotiate and compromise with others.
Right. Nice. You kept that to 5 minutes. Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
So, sort of, well, there's two things. The point about violence to me is I think, you could go throughout American history. There's lots of periods of times where there were riots. There's lots of periods of times where there was sort of, violence in the streets, etc. As I said before, the only two that I think are worthy of violence were the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. The Civil Rights Movement was the most impactful part of the Civil Rights Movement was peaceful. It was by design peaceful. It was the philosophical foundation of that movement for Martin Luther King, for the primary feature of it was peaceful. And that's why it was so impactful. The necessity for violence, this idea that there are things that, number one, that it's productive, and number two, that it's moral, I find to be both unreasonable, because nothing in very rare situations in history is violence something that was necessary and productive. And oftentimes what it does, especially to movements, and this is what's happened in Antifa. And,
30 seconds.
Okay, unfortunately with BLM, is it's delegitimized the movement, right? So, and this is what happened at the Capitol too. And now everybody looks terrible. The violence did not help, but that's where we are. And the more we keep condoning it, and the more we keep saying, well, it's okay, as long as it's an existential threat, whatever existential threat we make up, the worse it gets.
Yeah, good. Okay, do you have a response to that, Art?
So the Bonus Army March, following World War I, the government made a lot of promises to veterans that they didn't keep up. And there was a march of around 40,000 people on Washington, which was eventually broken up by the army. It was mostly a let's call it mostly peaceful. It wasn't really known for it being a violent. It was more of a persistent thing where the veterans simply refused to leave. They were camped out at the Capitol. They didn't go. They were told to go. They didn't go. And eventually the army was called in and cleared them out. And it was kind of a national disgrace at the time, but that was just how it was handled. So after World War II, there were huge changes in how veterans were treated in the U.S. There was kind of an understanding that didn't go well. And following that, it was understood that what they did in the period after World War I wasn't sufficient. So we had programs like the GI Bill, even like a retirement pay, medical. There was a sweeping changes because of the national stain and disgrace that the Bonus Army marches and just the general treatment of veterans left. So one could say that it would have been better if the veterans had not, camped out in the Capitol and made themselves a nuisance and all that. But I think that's where we're at, is that sometimes, it doesn't have to be, throwing Molotov cocktails. It doesn't have to be war, but sometimes pushing back does entail causing discomfort. And there are different degrees of that. And I think that the idea of like, well, if you break a store window, you've gone too far, but otherwise it's okay.
30 seconds.
You basically just have contexts where sometimes people just don't want to hear what you have to say. And that was the case with the Bonus Army. The government didn't want to deal with it at the time. They didn't want to hear it. And eventually they got tired of dealing with it. They made it go away. And sometimes there's no peaceful way to protest, like with civil rights, with people that just simply don't care about your point of view. They don't want you to win, and they will find some reason to stop you. So pushing back is fine. Sometimes violence is warranted. Most cases it's not, but it's like a spectrum.
And you guys are pretty good at this. That's all right. Actually, Art, so the next question goes to you first anyhow. And it's kind of a good segue what we've been talking about.
Okay.
Let's discuss some military spending. I'd like to say that this is one of the bigger differences between centrist and maybe the more progressive policies out there. Let's assume for a moment that progressive policies are more extreme, okay? Art, I would like to ask you, currently, the US holds the most military bases around the world, some 800 bases in over 70 countries, compared to, say, France or Russia, who only have around 30 bases worldwide outside of their respective countries. Both Democrats and Republicans alike consistently vote for bloated military budgets. Do you think that the view progressives tend to take, which is to cut back on military spending and close several of these international bases, is a good approach? And furthermore, what are your thoughts on a non-interventionist approach to global affairs?
Okay, well, that's interesting because it's not exactly in line with being. I mean, I guess you could argue that a different force posture would be a pretty extreme approach. So post World War II, we had a political paradigm for the world where you had the United States is either a superpower or the superpower as kind of an anchor for the Western democracies or of that type of mindset. Now, alternatively, darkly, you could say that we simply stepped into the imperialist colonial roles that the former powers of Europe once occupied. And so there's different ways to look at it, but either way, we're here now. So the discussion is, do you want to keep that or do you want to dismantle it? So, I mean, in a weird sense, they're both extreme positions because it's totally extreme to have one power dominate the world. When you get down to it, even though it's a status quo, it's a weird status quo. It's one that doesn't really, have a good parallel. But on the other hand, were we to dismantle and withdraw, you would have other forces step in. So you have Russia, China, very anti-democratic, nationalist, ethno-extremist in their own ways that would not create a better world were we to leave. However, our presence has not necessarily made things better in the ways that the protagonist, would probably say it has. So there's not really a good answer to it other than, we could probably cut our spending by a huge amount and bring back a lot of forces and still stay meaningfully engaged with the world at a lower level than what we're at now. And that's probably ideal. We should stay engaged with, multinational allies. We should have a world where we have, cohesion and compromise and, working together to the greatest extent possible to, protect the freedom and, the wealth and productivity of all. But sometimes we lean too heavy into it. We can be like Iraq, Afghanistan. Sometimes we go overboard. And it probably is safe to say that we could do half of what we're doing now and have a much better world and bring in our allies more, us do less, us spend a lot less, and have a softer presence that's more influential than, top-down driven.
Right. Nice. Nick, do you want to respond to that, or would you just like to answer the question yourself?
Let's do both.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. I probably won't need that long. So on foreign policy, me and Art agree most of the time, which is weird because domestically we're like opposites. Not opposites, but we disagree a lot. I agree with a lot of what Art said. I think we're we're not in an ideal situation, but strategically throughout the world, I think we sort of have to be there. We can get into the specifics of where specific bases or where specific military, whatever, are stationed and why they're there. But I think, look, we're in a globalized, our economy is globalized. We're in an interconnected world. We can't just pull out of everything. We can't become going back to an isolationist type foreign policy would be awful for us for so many reasons. Militarily, politically, economically, everything. So I think I just don't think that position's realistic. I'm not really sure if I would consider either necessarily extreme. But I just think we need to change how we do things, but not stop doing them.
Okay.
It's fair.
Fair. All right. Next question. Nick, let's move on to healthcare. It happens to be a top priority for all Democrats, starting with Eisenhower, who used to be a normal Republican, and including JFK, Truman Johnson. Healthcare became tied to jobs. with the Medicare option for those 65 and older. And years later, we'd see proposals such as Romney Care or Hillary Care, and we eventually got Obamacare, better named the Affordable Care Act. In recent years, ideas about universal health care, not universal health insurance, have become more popular. Can you tell us what your position is in general on the ACA, and whether or not we need to use the ACA as a stepping stone to universal health care, or if a more extreme approach such as sweeping legislation would be better?
So I'm assuming this question comes out of the fact that I told Chuck the other day that I was for universal health care. So the government spending stuff, I'm a little bit hesitant on. I'm no economist, I'm far from it. So I can't really get into like the intricacies of the economics. What I can say is I'm not for government paying for daycare. I'm not for government paying for universities. I'm not for universal basic income. Although I would be for a variation of universal basic income if it was specific to minority populations, people of color, in certain areas. As far as universal health care goes, Bernie Sanders got me there. I just don't see the argument any other way. I believe that every person has a right to get health care. For me, it's a moral question. I don't understand the economics behind it to sort of comment on that. And so I'm not going to get into it. But it does seem to me to be plausible that the amount of money that we sort of lose having a flawed healthcare system is not necessarily that different than the amount of money we would spend if we were able to cover everyone. But yeah, I mean, I think there has to be limitations. Cosmetic stuff would obviously not be a part of it. But, diabetics and cancer patients who don't have health care, I mean, that to me just seems like evil, right? And so, I guess, to answer your actual question, I think the ACA was the best way to go about it for the country. And I think that because of who I am and how I think the country should work. The ACA was a slow way of building up support for Medicare for all. But I think that, we are getting closer to that point. And I think you see that on even in the right wing, right? So now you're seeing support for the COVID checks and stuff like that on the Republican side. So I do think that, Medicare for all is something that's going to happen. I think it happened the way it should have happened, because I think if it all happened at once, it would have been too much of a shock sort of to the system. But it happened in a way that I felt like covered enough people, so it was okay.
Yeah, and that's what I expected from a more centrist position, because you're reaching across the aisle, right, to get things done.
Stop stereotyping me.
Let me stop the timer and move to you, Art. I'll give you 5 minutes if you'd like, unless you just want to respond. Do you appreciate a sweeping legislation to get to universal health care, or should we stick to sort of expounding upon the ACA?
Well, you look at what is at stake, and what we have is this kind of an interesting divergence over the last 100 years or so, where we had let's just say a number of experiments across the world where people tried a number of different things. And what's interesting is that people that have gone to basically, kind of single payer systems, let's say, across the world, nobody has gone to these systems and said, you know what, gosh, the Americans are really doing it right. Like when they got all these health, insurance companies involved, and we just made a mistake letting the government pay for all this. We should back out of this and just go let the free market figure this shit out. So I think it's pretty clear after this amount of time that we were simply doing it wrong. Right now, the ACA is a modified version of Nixon's original plan, which was modified by Mitt Romney and then picked up by Obama. And it is a mid-20th century idea that I think the idea came and went. And unfortunately, it was the best that we could do at the time. That doesn't mean that it's good, but it was the best we could do. So the amount of money we spend on this system, we pay way more than anyone else for a smaller level of service that is also covering fewer people. So the one advantage that we do have is because we're so big and wealthy, there are parts of our healthcare system that work better than anywhere else in the world, and this masks most of our problems. Because people look and say, well, our healthcare, like we're, like look at like, I don't know, Germany or Japan or UK or wherever. And if you look at smaller countries that are poorer, yeah, I mean, there are elements of our healthcare where if you've got a Cadillac plan in the US, you might not want to risk going to some government scheme that feels risky to you, and you have politicians that are making you feel terrified about it. But as a systemic approach, yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty objectively true that were we to adopt a single payer system where the government were to step in and provide health coverage for the entire country, it would be a net benefit for the entire country. And for things it didn't cover, like cosmetic care or other luxuries, we still got plenty of rich people in this country, and we always will. And if they want to spend extra out of their pocket for extra services, go for it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Just to
go ahead,
follow up on what I said, just to clarify, I still believe that people should be able to pick their own insurance. So I would say, Medicare for all, but we should still have private insurance.
Yeah, I don't. It should be banned, except for the wealthy if you want to pay cash.
I figured that. I mean, that's not surprising. So, fine.
All right, guys. Next question. Let's
To
see.
Art.
This one goes to you. Modern monetary theory and universal basic income. These may not necessarily be either extreme left positions or centrist positions. However, they seem to have been adopted by many people on the more extreme left. If you can sort of give us a short rundown of the subjects and maybe discuss why you view them as a net positive for the country.
Near him.
You. I'm sorry.
Okay. Oh, no worries. Okay.
That question.
All right. MMT, I don't know. It seems like just regular Keynesian economics that just happens to have a bit of a slightly different spin. So I honestly have never really totally grokked the distinction. I think that everyone can see at this point that both the Democrats and the Republicans 100% believe in deficit spending. It's like anything else. You need to spend money to make money. Like any business that exists in the United States has borrowed money that it wasn't currently making to buy facilities, to hire people, to expand, to do things that have grown their own, income, their net worth, their value. So a country is no different. The United States government is basically a corporation that exists to expand. So the money that it spends is an investment, and it grows the country from 1776 till now, when we had $1 million in the bank back in the day, versus now where we're running a multi-trillion-dollar economy. It has been proven year after year after year that the money the U.S. government spends grows the country. So as long as we keep inflation a little bit in check, it seems to be there's no question whatsoever the deficit spending is just fine. So as far as MMT goes, that's my angle on that. UBI is a bit of a different animal. And I think that it's, and with MMT, just really quick, people used to talk about a federal jobs program. A lot of people still do. I think that we're moving into an area where human labor is going to be displaced, a lot of instances by automation. And how long do I have left?
3 minutes and 10 seconds.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Wow.
Well, shit, I'm making good time. All right. So as we transition a bit, I think that, for the 20th century, I think that a federal jobs guarantee would actually have been a really good idea as far as keeping people. There's so many net benefits to, in that type of paradigm, being employed, having, just having income. A lot of times the government spends more money on, for instance, homelessness. We have like our city council here. We're just interesting talking to one of our local doctors who was explaining that we would actually save money if we paid people's rent and just breaking it down. He goes, we actually spent so much money on the homeless people we treat at the hospital here that we're losing money doing it for free. We actually, it's insane how broken our system is. So if you think about the cost of being poor, if you can't afford healthcare, if you can't afford food, if you can't afford housing, then you could have some medical issue that goes untreated, that gets worse. You could fall behind on your payments. You're unable to start a business. You're unable to keep your house. So many things happen in a chain reaction when you don't have a bit of income that wind up costing more in the long run the cost of poverty, or just, even mental health care, everything across the board, it's so crushing that the idea of a basic income that just gives people not enough to be comfortable in, but enough to just have a small amount of revenue coming in that allows you to pump money into the local economy and keep yourselves out of that worst angle of poverty, that part where things really go haywire. It would stop so many problems before they start, that I really think that it is the kind of thing where once we test it, even though it feels extreme now, you would realize that what you pay for winds up saving you, even in prisons, everything, all these like horrible downsides of poverty that just manifest in a million different ways. You can suddenly really dig into that and create a totally different society for far less of what you spend now. We just need to give it a try.
There you go. Nick, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I agree. I agree with the part that the way the system's set up now is completely flawed. I think we definitely do need to make changes. Like I said before, I don't necessarily have a problem with a UBI type system, but I think it needs to be sort of directed at poor people rather than middle class or rich. Like, I don't think it should be something that's universal. I think it should be specific. And I also think that we should take that the way to sort of uplift some people out of generational poverty and stuff like that, the people who really need it, requires a whole host of different things rather than just throwing money at the issue. And I know we talked about a federal jobs program and stuff like that. I haven't really thought about that. I don't necessarily know how it would work, so I don't really want to comment on whether it's good or bad. I'm also skeptical to just sort of, give all of this responsibility to the federal government or the state government. I sort of think that there is a practical sort of philosophical basis for individualism and self-determination. And I think when you sort of, and I know Art hates this argument, but I think that when you sort of, you start giving people things and you start sort of, everything's kind of, gifted out, then people lose that natural sort of drive towards doing things, because they just feel like, well, you know what, I can just rely on this, that this is going to happen or this is going to happen. And I'm not trying to say that people are necessarily lazy inherently, but I think that if a system is set up in a specific way that can allow people to get lazy, then a lot more people will choose to be lazy than not. And I already think we have some of that in the United States. So I'm skeptical, and this isn't scientific, right? And I obviously don't have any studies. The only other thing, but I want to point out, I think these conversations are necessary. Like, I don't think that Art or anybody else is extreme for believing in this or for raising the issue or anything like that. I think it's perfectly legitimate. I think it should be talked about. So I just want to put that out there. And what was the last thing? Shoot, I forgot what it was. Yeah, I can't remember what I was going to say.
All right.
Just interject really quick. Elon Musk, his parents were emerald miners from Rhodesia. And when he was in college, he used to carry around a pocket full of emeralds that his mom gave him to remind himself that no matter what, he would always be okay, and that he was from greatness and he would go to greatness. So I know I grew up around rich people, and a lot of people would have their parents pay for their phone, pay for whatever, and not just shower them with money, but like take care of things so that they could focus on not having to sweat every single bill that came in. And you have and from them, they're now doctors and lawyers and like actual, serious people, unlike us. No, I'm kidding. But people discount when you look at the American middle class and the upper middle class, the professional tier. These aren't people that just save their pennies from the paper route growing up. Like, these are people from families that were connected, that knew how to resource and cultivate generations of humans that would go off and be successful by setting them up for success. So I think that when you create contexts like that where people are resourced to succeed, then you set people up to succeed. And when you make them survive, you have people who survive. And I think that that's the distinction, that Americans tend to look at successful people and not think about how they got there and just assume that it must have worked out for a reason. But a lot of times that reason is that their parents were real smart and the parents knew what other parents were doing to set their kids up for success. And we should think of it in those terms and not in terms of kind of a sink or swim. Hopefully they don't get lazy. Like, hopefully, you know, it's the wrong way to think about it. And I just want to throw that out there.
So I think that's true. I think that people who are rich tend to, you know, have children who make a lot of money or well off. Middle class people tend to be middle class. I don't think, I think obviously they have more opportunity. They're given more opportunity. So that's obviously a part of it. I also think that when you're not in, I think that there's also sort of like a values part to that too, that that a lot of families, a lot of wealthier families, a lot of these middle-class families, and a lot of people who work their way out of poverty, which happens all the time, right? It's not something that doesn't ever happen. It's just hard to do. It's harder to do than, you know, if you're middle class. Are often have a work ethic, have a belief in themselves that they're capable of it. And I think that there's sort of there's a psychological and a familial and a value-based part of that that's sort of missing from that analysis. So like, yes, if you have more money, yes, statistically, all of that stuff. But there's also this is you know, what kind of values you should have. You should spend a lot of time doing this, spend a lot of time doing that, as opposed to a poor area where 90% of the people don't have fathers. They're in, you know what I mean? Stuff like that, where you're not, the family is just dynamic, just isn't there. So I just think that poverty in general is just a really complex issue. The only other point, the one that I forgot to make, is I sort of have an issue, and this isn't really based on anything scientific, but I sort of have an issue with the idea that you can just implement a UBI, a universal basic income system that's as massive as it would be, right? And then just take it away if it didn't work. And so that's sort of my problem too. It's kind of like, okay, well, you know, why not try it? Well, because what happens if it sucks, right? And there was some sort of like, you know, something we didn't expect to happen, or whatever. Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the next question then. I wanted to touch on some other sort of domestic, well, global issues, education, climate change. We sort of talked about healthcare, but those are sort of the other major ones. How do congressional leaders succeed in reaching across the aisle over these matters while being mindful of the ever-growing concerns with each of them? And Nick, this goes to you first.
So can you restate the question? So what issues specifically?
Education and climate change, because they're just about as big of subjects as healthcare, especially for Democrats. Let me reread the question.
Okay.
How do congressional leaders succeed in reaching across the aisle over these matters while being mindful of the ever-growing concerns with each of these?
Okay, so
How are you going to balance that, making the handshake across the aisle,
right,
addressing the issue?
So I would say that you would have to do it in a way where you could convince your base of supporters that you're fulfilling whatever their mandate for you is, even if you weren't necessarily doing that, or at least get something out of it, that because all of these people, right, that are congressional officials, right, they have a base of support, and they have to make sure that, you know, they're doing what they said they were going to do, right? And so that's what complicates this sort of stuff, this sort of compromise. So I think it's about sort of being skillful politically in how you sort of articulate the message to your base. And then in addition to that, really taking into account some of the concerns that you have personally, ideologically, and reaching a negotiation that makes sense for you. I guess that would be the best way. I think the problem I'm having with the question is what's important for education and what's important for the environment, for instance, are different for the right than it is the left.
So just separate the two. Touch a little bit on what you think can be done about education, and then touch a little bit about what you think can be done for climate change. Or choose one.
Yeah. So I think that there's so many variations, but I think that generally speaking, the left on climate change is a little bit over the top. I think the idea, the way that it's articulated, right? And this is where the amplification of people like AOC kind of screw the Democratic Party, because it's like the way that they're talking about it is this very limited period of time that we have to do these sort of ambiguous things and spend tons of money on them. And if we don't do them, then we're all going to die, right? Or something analogous, something very bad is going to happen. And the problem I have with that is there's lots of stuff that says that's not necessarily true. And what it does is it delegitimizes the left's argument and makes it harder for them. So what we need to do, in my opinion, is modify how we have that discussion. So yes, climate change is really important. Yes, we need to address it, but we need to address it reasonably and really, because the left talks to me about science all the time. They say it's science, 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 science. But when you really look at all of the science and you really, there's a lot of disagreement within the climate change community, right, of scientists about specific things. And so if you're only going with the most extreme interpretation, then, that's not going to necessarily, then you're setting yourself up for failure, is my point. And I think that's what the left does with that. Education. I think we need to spend more money on education. I think number one, we need better education. I feel like I'm running for president. We need better education in the poorer communities. So a lot of those communities are based off of property taxes, right? So they get the shittiest teachers, the shittiest resources, the shittiest everything, and then plus all the other obstacles that they have in their way. So we need, and I understand, what are those charter schools and stuff are supposed to sort of help that situation, but I don't think they necessarily always do, right? But they do a lot of good too. So in some way, I think that we need to sort of do stuff like that. We also, I would say, and I feel like this is more Republican, but I'm not sure. I would say we need more emphasis on doing things of preparing people for jobs that make sense, that are lucrative, and not stuff, all these people going to college to be with psychology majors and communication majors and poli-sci majors like me. It's like you get out, you owe $40,000, right? And you can't do shit, right? You can work at a job making $15 an hour unless you get a master's degree. What's that?
20 seconds.
20 seconds. So I would change the way that the education system is framed. I would change how we sort of allocate money to the various public schools. And I would change how we talk about the environment. And the right is terrible. So, okay.
Nice way to close that. Art, the same goes to you. Do you want me to restate the question?
No. So we'll start with climate change. So when I was talking earlier about having an Overton window, kind of an ask that's maybe higher than what you'd settle for, climate change is a weird example that's on that lane, because it's kind of like Russian roulette. Like you've got one bullet that's going to kill you in 30 years. You've got another that'll kill you in 60. You got another that'll kill you in 90. Another will kill you in 110. Like you kind of walk it out, and you're like, well, you guys are acting like we're all going to be dead in 30 years, or we'll have irreparable damage to the country in 30 years. When really, when you get down to it, there's only like a 20% chance of that happening. And really, it's more likely that we'll all be dead in 60 years. So like the fact that you guys are asking, like really, really like making this point that we've only got like this small amount of time to act, I really feel that it kind of hurts your cause. And the problem with that is, like, if you realize that it's a problem at all, then you kind of do want to plan for the worst case scenario, because even your next tier of better case scenarios are not good. And the idea that you should worry about making money, up until the point where it kills everything. I feel like the people who are making that argument, and there are a lot of them Republicans, are people who don't plan on being around to see it. So if you're in your 60s, 70s, or 80s, and you could be losing a lot of money getting into endeavors that have 100-year arcs that fix the planet, or reduce certain emissions, or what have you, then in that case it doesn't matter. You're going to heaven anyway. You're a good Christian. You fought the libs and own the libs and whatever. And, like, for them, they don't care. They don't believe that there's any problem, or they honestly, seriously just are in a state that's equivalent to nihilism, where they simply don't care what happens to the planet when they're gone. They think that it's fine enough now and it won't matter, down the road, or they figure their grandkids will fix it, whatever. So in that case, it really does, it kind of speaks to the idea that sometimes you really can't negotiate with people. Like, sometimes you just need to make a very strong ask and pull as many people as you can in as soon as you can, and just go from there. Because the people that you're trying to negotiate with, they actually don't. Everyone dying is totally okay with them. They'll just go to heaven anyway. Like, you're dealing with a subset of people that really, there's nothing on the table that interests them. So with that, I think that you should go balls to the wall, because most of the planets on board, you really just have America and a subset of Americans that are dragging their feet. And every year that goes past, you'll have more and more people on board with extreme climate change action. You just get ahead of the curve on that one. That's where it's all going anyway. So just get ahead of the curve. With education, it's an interesting thing, because as humans live longer and society changes, more specific tasks get automated, human labor is going to change a lot. And even though I think there'll always be jobs to a certain extent, once we have AI that's up and running, like, imagine a database of all AI, all medical research, all diagnoses, everything that's all run by an AI. It can look at a scan from an X-ray. It can do anything that a doctor could do. Up until the point where it's better than a doctor, you'll still need doctors. But at a certain point, you'll train it to a point where it's simply better than any human doctor, and you won't need human doctors to do that anymore, because the AI will never forget. It will never slow down. It will get better and better and better until the point where it's just simply unbeatable, which is wonderful. That's what we want. You can't beat a chess computer right now. There's no human chess expert right now that could beat a high-end chess machine. You get past a certain point and it just doesn't work anymore. For most human technical jobs, it'll be quite the same. So with medicine, I say this as an example for education. Education should be free, because humans being educated progresses society. It changes everything. It lifts us out from being basic animals that do menial tasks to having higher function. So that is something, that's one of the few reasons we should have a government at all, is to provide education. So we need to get to the point where education is free.
Nice. Nick, do you have anything to add to that?
So I think this sort of goes to the principal point that I'm making in this debate. The negotiating tool that that Art's advocating for, this Overton window, this bargaining chip, right, is having the opposite effect, in my opinion. So you already, the right wing of the Republican Party is ridiculous on this issue, right? Especially some of them are like, I don't believe it's even happening, or if it's happening, it's just totally, what's going to happen no matter what, or whatever it is. So you're not dealing with a full deck of cards, right? So if you're going at it and you're saying this is the most extreme, you're using the most extreme data, you're sort of acting as if it's an existential threat. You're being dismissive of other data, right? And you're sort of whatever. When you come to the table with your perspective, what you're going to do is you're going to make those people, you're going to, turn them off even more. You're not going to bring them in with these sort of extreme ideas. Now, we're in a position right now where you got the Senate and you got the House, right? But you only got a sliver of the Senate, and you don't have that much of the House either. So there's still some compromise needed, right? Because you still got Joe Manchin, you still got Kirsten Sinema, you still got lots of people, right, that you're going to have to convince. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's no way that a Joe Manchin is going to give in to a Green New Deal type scenario. So there's still some compromise that you need to make. Now, if you're starting,
20 seconds.
okay, if you're starting that negotiation with, we're going to die in 5 years, we need 700 gazillion trillion dollars, give it to us now, and we're going to save the world. I don't think you're going to get anywhere. You're just going to halt negotiations. You're going to give Republicans a talking point. You're going to delegitimize your own position. That's it.
All right.
And I would say that that's fine. And the reason I say that is because when you make your position that we need to deal with this in 100 years, they'll say, great, 2060, let's get together. We'll come up with some plans. But like right now, we have other priorities. We need to cut taxes. We need to cut regulation. And you know what? 100 years is 100 years away. So the problem is that when you're dealing with people that are irrational or they simply don't want to come to the table at all, there's no point in having any kind of compromise position with them. Sometimes you just need to overpower them. And with this, having an extreme position that says, hey, you have 5 years to deal with this, and in 30 years, we're completely fucked. Like we are wiped out. With that, that puts a lot of pressure on people to pick a side. And most of the world is picking a side. And every year that goes by, we get more people on our side. So unfortunately, trying to be reasonable with people that have no interest whatsoever in being reasonable is simply allowing them to win. And you're basically you're stopping the fight before you even begin it. So in this case, unfortunately, yeah, it does turn some of them off, but fuck them.
Yeah. Sorry.
You cannot do that. That is illegal.
I'm so sorry.
As the moderator, we've had this discussion.
Oh yeah, actually, that's a good point. But I appreciate it. But yeah, no.
Sorry. All right. Let's move on. Let me figure out where I was. Let's move on to right-wing extremism just a touch.
My favorite.
This is for you, Art. So would you say that on the right, centrism, so we're talking about center right, has been more effective than their right-wing extremists at getting policies passed? And this is my favorite part, do any coalitions between Democrats and Republicans further the Democratic agenda more or the Republican agenda more?
Oh, I mean, I'm all for Jimmy Dore's Boogaloo Army, if that's what you're asking. But no, it's an interesting thing because, you talk about centrism and extremism, and then you talk about the status quo versus progress, but you're also talking about like entropy and chaos. So you have these concepts that are weirdly, vaguely related, but not always the same. Yeah. So with something like conservatism, if you think about, what a lot of, traditional American conservatism is, and without getting pejorative, let's just say, if you think back about the 1950s, and let's say an innocent view of it, like there are some people who take it into a dark place. But let's just say that people look back and say that there was a part of, American power, prestige, where things were improving. And there's this arc that America took that people look back on and say, you know what, that was great. Like, even though things weren't perfect, there's elements of that we should try to recapture. And this is just, again, being really innocent and nice about it. Yes, but the problem with that, I'm sorry, what?
Tiptoe.
Yeah. So, but the problem is that things change. So you can't preserve things without action. Like the status quo doesn't preserve itself. You actually do need to take steps. And a lot of times, and now I'm going to say that in every single case, the status quo of stability and compromise and moderation was brought about by extremism. Now, when you have the right kind of extremism that brings you to a good place, then you want to preserve it. It's like starting a company. Starting a company is wild, like it's crazy. But then you get to a point where you make a ton of money. That's awesome. Like you want that. You want to have a nice company that's making a lot of money. But if you don't tend to it, it falls apart and you stop making money. So there's an arc where maintenance is important. And with right-wing extremism, the problem is a lot of times it's a cargo cult. And without getting into the whole story of what a cargo cult is, there are ideas that people arrive into wealth and prosperity or good times, but they don't know how they got there. They weren't there for that arc. So they take steps to preserve it that aren't in line with how they got there. You could have a very progressive type of a past that led you to what you think is a very conservative present, but you can't, you basically, you want it with people that don't understand how they got where they are, and the extremist methods they take to get there or try to preserve it tend to go with the symbolism and not the substance of it. And you have a similar problem on the left where people, get ideas in their heads that aren't going to work and they try too hard for it. But with the right, a lot of times it's reaching back for a past that they didn't create. They don't understand how it got there. It's like people trying to undo the New Deal, all these programs, and they don't understand that what they love about this like 1950s, 60s society was built on the New Deal. So I went afield on that one, but so
No, that's great.
Okay.
That's wonderful. Nick, same question to you. Do you think that right-wing extremism has been effective in helping shape the policies that they want on the right? And if so, or whatever, if not, do you think that those compromises further the Republican agenda or the Democratic agenda?
So, I mean, we could get into what constitutes as extreme in the right wing, right? I think that they're a pretty extreme party just generally, but first of all, I don't think that Republicans are conservatives anymore. I think they're populists, nationalists. I think conservatism is sort of out the window. There is some of it in there, and there are some people within the Republican Party who are conservative, I guess, but I wouldn't consider them conservative. No, I think that what the Republican Party has done by being crazier is made itself less electable throughout the country. I think it lost a lot of seats in the House in 2018. It has irreparably, or at least as it exists right now, damaged itself since what happened with the election. I think the crazier they get, the less out of the mainstream they go. So I think they're hurting their agenda in the long run. But during Trump's presidency, I think they were able to get a lot of center-right things done, which is strange because Trump ran as a populist, existed as a populist, and sort of presented himself as a populist while he was president, while he did very sort of a lot of centrist sort of conservative things like judges and passing tax cuts and etc. So no, I think they placate their base. I think they placated their base for a period of time in order to get their agenda passed. And now that they're just a goddamn mess and they're hanging on from a string, and I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the more extreme that each party gets, the less powerful they become. So.
Okay. Alrighty. Art, did you want to say anything back to that, or should we move on? No.
I mean, right-wing extremism is, we've kind of glossed over a lot of that, but a lot of times they're just trying to recreate this mythic past that they just don't understand how they got there in the first place. So what they look at tends to have no bearing on what they actually want. I think. I think a lot of times they're just. I'm not going to go there. Well, yeah. Let's be generous and say that they're floundering. Yes, we'll say that instead.
Well, I mean, the problem with evaluating the right is that they don't have any sort of. They no longer have an ideological foundation, right? They're just all about grievance and and Trump, right? It's just a cult of personality. So I don't know. It's just I don't know. It's hard to evaluate.
True.
All right. Next question goes to you, Nick, and it's technically our last question unless we have time for the bonus question. We'll focus on end goals here. The premise of centrism is to sort of take a slower and more methodical approach in passing legislation. It is the idea that reaching across the aisle is more sound and ultimately better for the country. In contrast, more what we've been calling extreme approaches involve usually sweeping legislation meant to immediately resolve longstanding issues. And the idea there is that these problems have gone on too long, so long that we have created apathetic voters and angry voters because they don't see a return for their votes. So Nick, I'd like to hear your ideas about those differences and see if maybe you feel that the end goal is the same for both centrists and extremists within the Democratic Party.
What do you mean the end goal? I'm a little bit confused by that.
I'm so sorry. I'm freezing.
That's okay.
Am I back? I'm sorry, I was freezing.
Yeah.
Basically that whether you're farther left on the spectrum or you're more center left, that we ultimately want a lot of the same things, like on education, healthcare, climate change, such what we've been talking about. But the approach is different between centrists. Centrists tend to want to reach across the aisle more and make compromises to get things moving along. But
I think the priority, yeah, I think the priorities are different. So in other words, I'm concerned right now. My primary concern right now is the country and the stability of it, and the how long it's going to last, honestly, in its current condition. So from what we should prioritize, I think it should be to getting back to a place where the parties aren't so weak and the system isn't so fragile, right? And I'm not really sure how you get back to that, but that's my, my basic concern as my individually. I don't know if you talk to other moderates and centrists, if they would say that too. The difference with, people, what's that?
You're the only one I talk to. I'm just kidding.
That's funny. There's not many of us. We're not an army. As far as like the further left you go, I think that they're more focused on what they want, right? What they want, and this is true in both the right and the left. I think that they tend to frame issues as existential, and they do it too quickly. The problem isn't that, so like during the civil rights movement, like that was a necessary movement, right? And the stuff that Art was talking about, the type of protesting that he talks about, I am totally in favor of. Peaceful protesting, civil disobedience, that kind of stuff, I think is a totally legitimate way for an oppressed group or people to protest. But there has to be some proportionality. Every topic, every policy, every single thing is being turned into this major radical issue, and it doesn't need to be. And so that's sort of what I'm saying. Like the difference is how we're perceiving things. And if your perception of an issue is we have 5 minutes to live if we don't pass this policy now, then your reaction to that is going to be a little bit more extreme than mine. And I think that reaction sometimes is based on people being unreasonable, or people being tribal, or people being, overly simplistic, or just sort of in a bubble and not sort of finding their way out of their information bubble that they're in. I don't know if I'm answering your questions. I feel like I'm just talking now.
Well, no, I mean, it was sort of meant to allow you the chance to,
elaborate.
To wrap up your views on the differences. So, unless you have anything else to say, it's
no, that's it.
Okay, so let's talk about Big Daddy Saul Alinsky. So he wrote a fantastic book called Rules for Radicals. And in the opening of this book, he talks about the Declaration of Independence and what a bunch of bullshit it was. And he's like, when you get down to it, the founders did not need to revolt. And if they had explained their problems in ways that were framed more fairly to the British, for instance, some of the taxes that the British had levied were to pay for wars that Britain had fought in our defense. So there were issues that the founders intentionally misrepresented because they were trying to create a framework where they were just justified to act. And Alinsky's point was that it was a net good, in the long run, although, arguably, I guess if the British had won, we'd have universal healthcare now. So maybe it wasn't. But the point, as a joke, people watching at home. But the point is that you have now two different sides that have understood and learned how to take positions and like weaponize them and turn them into these extreme points. And when you're not willing to lose, that's what you do. Like you have people who defend the status quo or people that are agents of change. And depending on how serious the issue is, traditionally in normal like human behavior, we kind of have patterns that we fall into naturally.
Hmm.
But when you study how these patterns work and how they can be exploited, you now realize that the left and the right are operating under these kind of radical paradigms where with the right, they don't want to give an inch against, let's say, BLM. So they need to, at some point, worry about white genocide. They need to worry about immigrants coming into the country. They need to worry about, Black folk who don't know their place no more. And there's these threats that get pervasive within elements of conservatism that used to have these more cultured and eloquent gatekeepers that would speak to those concerns with encoded language. But at a certain point, that doesn't work anymore. When you're losing ground against people that are determined to advance, you have to go the radical route because it's simply more effective. And it makes it harder to compromise, but that's the point. They're not willing to compromise. And the people who are advancing on them are no longer willing to compromise. You've had a lot of civil rights activists that have been told incrementalism for 100 years. And they don't really want to have incrementalism anymore. And with issues like gay rights and gay marriage, which are now giving way to trans rights, you had this hardcore march that really is just not backing down, and it makes people uncomfortable, and they don't care. They're just going to keep pushing forward until they get what they want. And on the right, they're in that same boat now, where they're going to lose, and they know it, unless they get more and more extreme. And the extremism may not work, but centrism is certainly not going to work, because that's moved their negotiating position to somewhere where they don't want to go. They simply don't want more Mexicans in this country. They don't want immigrants from other parts of the world. They're uncomfortable with America being less white. So there's no negotiating from that. If America not being a white majority country makes you uncomfortable, you don't have a lot of options. And at some point, you have to give in to very dark powers that are going to say stuff that's going to get people fired. And you're going to have these Twitter cancel culture, things going on where people, cry about getting canceled. And oh gosh, like I can't even have an opinion that's different before you use speech Nazis, get me fired from my job. But that's where it's going. Is that when both sides are this extreme, ultimately there's really no advantage for either to back down, because we want diametrically different things. And unfortunately, there are periods like this where extremism has to be the standard, because the status quo or the center point doesn't serve anyone. Unfortunately, somebody doesn't have to lose, somebody's gonna have to win. And that's where we're at in the large portion of this country with a lot of political issues. There are some things we don't need to be there on, but we are anyway, like taxes on the wealthy. Populists don't give a shit. Your average Trump supporter, they don't care. They just happen to be swept in with these other cultural issues that they do care about. And then they get wound up with these weird things where they're voting for Trump to build a wall, but also Trump's cutting his own taxes and he's deregulating his own businesses. They don't care about that stuff, but they get hijacked into them. And unfortunately, you have a couple of wedge issues that people are just not willing to back down on. And that's America 2021. We have a very radicalized in both directions country that is just bifurcating us into these ways. How long do I have left?
25 seconds.
Okay. That's wow. Boom. Okay. That's bifurcating us into camps that we don't even necessarily agree with in most of the issues, but there's a handful of issues that we're just not willing to back down on, that somebody's gonna have to win, somebody's gonna have to lose. And that's just all there is to it. And then once we get past those issues, hopefully we can get back to a point. It's like anything else. Sometimes periods are more extreme and then they're more moderate. Once we get past some of these really sharp divisive issues, we can get back to a place where the moderation is more of the norm. Let's hope.
Nice.
So,
Nick,
I obviously disagree with that. So
bring it.
I don't think that it's a correct analysis. I think the reason that immigration is the way it is on the right is because Congress didn't pass legislation. We can talk about the different reasons for that, but the fact that things are so uncertain makes people anxious. If we do come up with a system, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, with Reagan, with the first Bush, with the second Bush, they had in comparison, they had very liberal immigration policies in comparison to today's Republican Party. There's a reason it's gotten like that. some of that reason is because right-wing talk radio and news has sort of indoctrinated them in bad ways, but they're also more susceptible to that indoctrination. And that's because the political system isn't working the way it should be. It's sort of leaving these huge question marks. And so the other issue I have, with the immigration point is that being an immigration restrictionist is a totally legitimate position, or believing that immigration is maybe a net negative for the country for various reasons is not inherently racist. There's an economic argument, whether you agree with it or not. There's a political argument, there's a social argument, there's a cultural argument, there's a pragmatic argument. And so I think that we make a mistake, and this is sort of where the extremism comes in for me, is that we make that a mistake by oversimplifying things as being racism or white supremacy or based on, fear of Mexicans or whatever.
All right.
There are economic arguments, but they're wrong. I just want to throw that out there. Like, I mean, in nearly any study, you increase the amount of workers in here, you have new customer bases. I mean, there's a huge amount of evidence that shows that more immigration actually adds to the net value of America, except for a very small percentage of Americans, which are basically like high school dropouts who are native. Like beyond that, it turns into a net negative for everyone else. But a lot of the fear of that, of people who don't know, that's weaponized and it plays to their latent concerns in other areas.
I mean,
but it's a thing.
Yeah, I think it's a disputed point, and I think we could go back and forth about it. And it's certainly something to look into, but it's still something that people believe in, right? And whether they're wrong or right, it's not necessarily motivated by racial animus. That's all.
All right. Would you guys like to do the bonus question?
You know that we do.
Oh my God, bonus question, Antifa. Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
No!
It has to do with social practices of centrists versus extremists. This one's a little easier to define because the more extreme faction of the party may lean towards supporting radical protests or policy proposals that come out, such as like defund the police. Without making assumptions about your stance on these issues, what do you think the benefits are in how the Democratic Party aligns itself with these more activist sort of practices on the left? Art, you get to answer this first.
You're going to have to repeat the question, but go ahead.
Okay. I mean,
it's going down.
Yeah.
It's so funny because like you get these people on the right who complain that like why doesn't Joe Biden complain about Antifa? It's like Joe Biden has, complained about Antifa, but the difference is Antifa doesn't give a shit what Joe Biden has to say. They hate him as much as they hate Trump. So on the other hand, you have like these, guys who are storming the Capitol who are like, President Trump invited us. Like they're screaming into the camera, wearing Trump hats and carrying Trump flags. So, unfortunately, we had this weird, like, this kind of this mirror image that's actually not a reflection at all. Like the forces that are mobilized and activated on the left are not Democrats. Like they're people that freaking hate Democrats. But the Republicans love to paint all these people as though they're all kind of in on it together and like somehow like AOC is the secret general marshaling everyone for George Soros and all that. And it's basically this ignorance and paranoia and intentional lies that are painted to create this sense of fear that's just not true. Like if Joe Biden were to come out and like try to negotiate with Antifa, they'd tell him to go get fucked. Like they have no interest in what he's got to say. Like he's just not an element to them other than an enemy. Whereas on the the QAnon side, QAnon's like a cult based around a game show host. Like it is insanity. But this is like where we're at, where like if Trump were to come out and say, hey, I'm Q, I've been feeding you guys information all the time, we're going to get these pedos, like we're on it. There's simply no parallel. And now there is political violence on the left and the right. Antifa, BLM, they're burning, things got burned down. People got killed. Riots happened. Lots of problems. No question. But it was something that was not a Democrat operation. This is organic. These are people that generally tend to hate Democrats. Whereas on the right, these are the hardest of hardcore Trump supporters, the people that were hoping that he would lead a revolution and like General Flynn would show up on a winged horse and like decapitate Mike Pence. Like, it is insanity, but they're not really comparable, other than you have different sides of the spectrum where people are dabbling in violence, but like, it's really like insincere to compare them because they're coming from different places, and they're really not comparable, other than in the very broadest of terms.
Nick, do you want to respond to his stance, and then I'll re-ask the question to you? Okay, go ahead. 2 minutes.
So I think that's right. I think his distinction is right. I don't think that they're as connected to the Republican Party the way that the right wing, far right is. I think that the Republicans disingenuously but effectively often, with their own base, associate Antifa with Democrats. One of the reasons why it's effective is because, and it's not just Antifa, right? Because people get stuck on the word, but just analogous groups that are violent or riot at protest, whatever those groups are, whoever those people are, they're involved in a protest that's associated with the left wing, and so they get related. But yeah, I don't think that they're more anti-government, whatever. So I 100% agree with that point. The one thing that I will say about Joe Biden is he has unequivocally denounced them, but he did take a while. And so I think he did it in September. He was asked about it prior to that, several months, and gave sort of these equivocating answers.
Shall we go into the question?
What's the question? Sorry.
Let me restate it for you.
I was just responding to what he said.
Yeah, let me restate this though, because I have a feeling it's connected to your response to him.
Mm-hmm.
Without making assumptions about your stance on these issues, what do you think the benefits are and how the Democratic Party aligns itself with these more activist sort of practices on the left, such as when they came out and said things like defund the police or the Black Lives Matter protest?
It is tied into what I was going to say. So the other place I was going with that is, I think that, so this is sort of at the fundamental disagreement that we have about political approaches strategically to politics is that it's not that 17 Democrats came out the next day and said defund the police, although some did, right? And those are the ones who get their voices amplified, or at least they agreed with it to some extent, and then they were put on the front page of the New York Post the next day. It isn't like that. What it is like is sort of like what Trump does with the white supremacy stuff, is he sort of goes back and forth, right? He's like, yeah, those I have nothing to do with those people. I don't know who those people are, right? I think the Democrats have their own version of that with Antifa, and you certainly see it online when you're talking to people who often will just immediately minimize what Antifa does or what leftist groups do, or that's their reflex, right? That's where they want to go with it. So I think that's a mistake to me. So instead of that equivocation, they should just denounce it, right? Defund the police is not a good idea. Just say it, right? We should reform the police. Say what you mean, market it the way it should be. Because when you do equivocate on those things, you enable the Republican Party to portray you in a specific way. Give them a solid answer. Make it unambiguous, make it firm, make it quick. That's the problem the Democrats have, is they don't do that.
All right. Do you have anything to respond to that, Mr. Art?
Sure. I just saw a knife past my head.
No, that's solid.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, then we can move on to closing arguments. You guys are just super boring tonight. There's been like no fireworks. I'm so
what? I thought that was good.
No, I actually I think it was, I think it was much better. And you also asked, you asked good questions.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I was worried you guys were sort of going to run your mouths over me because I tend to be a little less like conflicting and not bitchy enough. And I was like,
I'm also really tired.
Attention, but the timers worked and this was great, guys. So closing, go ahead, Art.
Also, I was going to say that we have a lot of respect for you as a moderator, so when you tell us to be quiet, we stop.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's true.
Which we would ignore most people, obviously.
All right, that's cool. Thanks, guys. All right, so closing arguments. I don't care who goes first, so.
Okay, well, you went first last time. I'll go. So we're in an interesting period right now because you have a lot of the status quo, moderate type of elements of the country that feel that things are slipping away. So it's a harder time for anybody to be a moderate because the old answers aren't really working, which is why you have a lot of the Republicans have given up on conservatism and they're kind of flooding towards populism. Now, in periods where, to go back to my earlier example of a fire station where you have a known problem, which is fire, and known ways to deal with it, which is firefighters and having a fire station and all of that. When everybody understands what the problem is, and it's kind of just something you deal with, and society comes together to deal with problems, things are a lot easier. It's easier to figure out and compromise and have a moderate solution when everyone's pretty much on board with what the issues are. And in times of upheaval like we're at now, it gets harder for anybody to be moderate because nobody really agrees on what the problems are exactly. And people know that they're unhappy, but they want different solutions. So like any other period in history, you have certain times where moderation is the way to go because you've achieved something stable. And when you've got good times, you want to let the good times roll. And when you have periods where change is needed, sometimes you can't really split the difference between, for instance, Florida and Spain. That's the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Sometimes you just need to pick a direction and go. And that means that half the people are going to be unhappy and the other people are going to be unhappy or happy and unhappy. So we're at a period right now where, unfortunately, you're just going to have people who are going to be unhappy because we don't really have good middle points right now. Everybody's in their own ways, anxious and afraid, or they are rising in power or dropping in power, or things are changing, and they just feel like now is not the time to come together and negotiate. And I am temporarily making an argument in favor of a more extremist approach. And even if that's less conducive to compromise, and it pains me as someone who makes a living negotiating, but sometimes there are times where you simply have to win, and you need to bring about a solution that the other side might not necessarily want, but it's going to be in their best interest. It's like the funniest thing, like you have these leftists who are talking about like fighting with conservatives, and we're like, you better hope I don't win or else I'm going to give you free healthcare. Like, it's funny, like, but you have these fights going on where ultimately you're fighting for other people who are fighting against you. And, this like racially equal society, these people who are afraid of cancel culture, they're afraid of trans people, they're just afraid in general. But if we actually get to that society, they'll be fine. It'll be a wonderful society for everyone. It'll be great. And you just have people who are just afraid of a future they don't understand. And unfortunately, sometimes you just have to drag them to it. And we're at a period like that right now. And I think that it would be a mistake to go in a more moderate direction, even though it feels like compromise is the better and more charitable and equitable way to go. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes you need to, take the hard line, and you need to win, and you need to do the right thing, even if other people are against you. And that's not an ideal position for a democratic society to be in, but it happens. And we're just in a phase like that right now. So I think that to everyone out there listening, hold the line. Don't feel bad that other people are upset and, they're worried about getting canceled. They're worried about this and that. But if you've got better ideas and you're trying to build a better society legitimately for everyone, sometimes you have to drag people across the finish line. And I think we're in a position like that right now.
Okay.
Very nice. Your turn.
So I agree with Art that the point is that we have to beat whatever the hell is going on right now, right? I just think that my idea is different than his. So I believe that wholeheartedly that taking, because essentially what you're doing, what I'm hearing is we need to sort of mimic the extreme that they're going to mimic some of their tactics, mimic their approach, right? And I think that when you do that, you exacerbate the problem. You don't solve it. So I'm not advocating for not, you know, supporting certain policies. I think you should reasonably articulate and debate what those policies are. But I think the real way to beat Trumpism is by being not like Trumpism, by not being intolerant, by not being simplistic, by considering other things, and by also understanding that the entire, that everybody who voted for Donald Trump isn't an extreme person, that the worst elements of the party aren't the people who represent the entire party. And that what you'll find is that once you sort of you sort of show support for some degree of kind of compromise and unity, that you'll find people to be a lot more open than you might think. And I think, there's a lot more people out there who aren't as vocal about their beliefs, who are more moderate in their beliefs, who probably see the left as going a little crazy. And I think that we need to get back to a place where we're respectful to other people. We don't just assume they're stupid. We don't call them stupid. And I'm just as guilty as other people are. We refine our approach in how we talk to people and how we identify people. We don't dismiss them as being evil. We try to listen to what they say. And if what they say is racist, if what they say is evil, if what they say is all of those things, then sure, let's dismiss them away. But I think the more we move to our left and our right, the further away from each other we go, and the less likely we are to ever come back together. I don't think it's a temporary thing. I think it just sort of cements itself. So so that's it. That's my whole perspective. Sorry I wasn't as lively tonight. Next episode, I'll punch my computer screen and yell at somebody.
Yeah.
No,
this is great.
We could do fun things where
I had a really good time. I thought that was a great debate, actually.
Now I feel as bad. Like everyone's like, oh, like that was like, I thought it was good.
Yeah, I do too.
More importantly, the people at home are going to think that this is good. So go ahead and hit the like, the subscribe, the bell, and the other button, the button. And share. Make sure to share. Absolutely.
Oh, I will. I genuinely think this was a very, very good discussion. So I'm going to play the music. Do you have something to say, Heather? You want to send us off with your? Okay.
No, I'm good.
There it is.
Okay.
Play this before every sports game. Pretty good dance moves. Okay.
Yep, there we go. I'm feeling it.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.